Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us here at Philosophy, where it is still, despite all the website changes, like philosophy and coffee at the same time. This is going to be an interesting conversation. My we'll go with friend, Molly is joining me today. Her and I have known each other for how long, do you think?
4 years.
4 years? Yeah. And how much of that did we hate each other?
I don't think you ever hated me. I think it was pretty one-sided, but it was definitely up until recently.
Yeah, and not without justification.
You were a pretentious douche.
I was a pretentious douche.
I was kind enough to put that in past tense.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's apropos that I was a pretentious enough douche to use words like apropos, because we're here to talk about what is perhaps the antidote to pretentious douchebaggery around the world, and that is populism. But of course, populism is, like most political concepts, a dual-edged sword. It is not solely a force for good. As with any tool, be it mechanical or political, populism can also be turned towards wicked ends. We've seen a wave of right-wing populism, and we're going to address the difference in a moment between right and left-wing styles of populism. We've seen a wave of right-wing populism sweep around the globe. Marie Le Pen almost took France. Thankfully, she fell just short of that, and we got what today could be considered a major victory in the form of a centrist. We've seen far-right populist political parties emerge in places like Hungary and even Poland. Britain, of course, was carried away from the EU partially by populism.
A good mix of left and right populism in that case.
True, yes. And that is something that's very much worth noting, because there are good and bad reasons for the populist decisions that they made. And of course, two profoundly negative examples are our own president, Donald Trump, who is part of what I would call the anti-intellectual populist tradition. Also the rage-filled douchebag populist tradition. And then the recent election of Bolsonaro in Brazil is another moment of far-right populism. Although what's scary about Bolsonaro is, whereas Trump seems to be your confused, angry uncle, who's literally the walking embodiment of a chain email, Bolsonaro has some actively malicious but well-coordinated and thought-out policy plans.
And a long history of political action.
Yes.
With the structures to back up those plans.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, how do you look at populism? This is the definition part of everything. How are you defining populism when you talk about it?
Well, and that was kind of what got my interest rolling on this topic when I started thinking about it last week, is because we never really take the time to define it. And I was thinking about that and realized that the counter definition is pretty descriptive too. So when I was thinking of populism, to me it's just the appeal to the common masses, however vague of a concept that is. Mm-hmm. But it's generally supposed to be appealing to the needs of the average person. And so I think that gets into a really interesting area when we think about what does it mean to be anti-populist in that sense, but that's how I would define it.
All right, so we're appealing to the needs of the average person.
Mm-hmm. Needs, desires, concerns, wants.
Yeah. I guess I take a slightly different view. The way I've thought about populism, I started it in the same place. Historically, I have always been extremely anti-populist. Lately, I've been coming round, thanks to some people like Molly and Michael Brooks and the Sam Cedar Majority Report. They've all done a good job articulating a vision of populism I can get behind. But my concern with populism is not that it addresses the needs and the wants and the desires of the average person. My problem has always been that populism never presents much of a challenge, at least the way I've seen it negatively, it doesn't present much of a challenge when the desires of the average person are counterproductive or outright harmful. So like a far-right populism that has nativist appeals, like Bolsonaro, saying explicitly that he does not care at all about the indigenous peoples in the Amazon. He's going to open the whole thing up for industry. And the populists who agree with him look at that and they think, yeah, Brazil for Brazilians, and we're going to have good jobs. And so that kind of want and desire and need, because you do need work, is destructive. Now, I know that that's not the sum total story of populism, because, well, why would you say that's not the case? Because I think you would disagree that.
And first, to be fair, that was how I viewed your perspective on it as well. When you took an anti-populist stance, I understood that it was because you essentially didn't trust the demands of the little person. And so that was one of the issues that I address in my own, mental activities around this area. I go into that aspect of what does that mean to not trust people to know their own wants and needs. Sorry, what was the question again?
I actually kind of also don't remember, but more interestingly, I want to see what you think. I want to ask, why do you think, this is a stupid question on face value, but...
As most of yours are.
Why do you think we should trust the common person to have a clear perception of what they need? And let me preface it so I don't come across as a total jackass. The only reason I say that is we live in a very, very, very complicated world. And to take a common example, a coal miner. He wants and needs productive work.
And to him, that only looks like a coal job,
Exactly.
as far as he knows. Yeah.
So to show him that coal work isn't the only productive work for him, and to show him that it's not even good work, that it's hurting him and the environment and the community and the planet, an external force has to come along and educate him. Whether it's a formal setting or like an informal setting.
Okay.
So, yeah, how do you think we get over that problem of why do you think we should take it at face value that people will know what they want or need when the world is so complicated?
Well, and it will never be so simple as our ideal scenario, of course. But as you say, it is a matter of education, of informing people. But that's our job. If we're going to assign ourselves more importance as intellectuals and educated people, if we're going to hold ourselves as the elite, it's our job to reach those people in a way that they understand. And the first point of it all to me, and this is where I come from, even from like an ethical standpoint, you have to remind yourself that you're not better than people. You don't know better than them. Maybe you have more information than them on a topic, but you're not, as a general rule, a better, more enlightened person. You have to reach them as an equal. You can't be talking down to people. So it's our job to present information. But we also need to remember that we're not telling coal miners things they don't know necessarily. When you're saying we need to make sure they know that it's bad for them, they know that. They fucking know that. They're in the mines every day. They're coming out coughing with black lung, whatever.
Good point. It's pretty noticeable.
And if you talk to someone from West Virginia, there are shows that do a decent job of getting in there and actually giving those people a microphone. They know that. They're aware that they're shitty jobs, and they're not desperate for those jobs. They just understand that there aren't a lot of other options in that climate. So they demand those jobs because they know their own land so well. They know that nobody has ever come in there with a decent other opportunity for them. Corporations aren't hauling into there. Google's not looking to put another site in fucking West Virginia.
Yeah.
So they're working with what they have to work with. And I think you'll see that if you talk to people in those areas. about somebody like Donald Trump. I saw a really good interview actually with a guy who was from a coal family, and he said, we all know Donald Trump is a fucking spoiled rich ass kid who born with a silver spoon in his mouth, never did anything, but he told us we could have jobs, and we're dying here. Like, that's what we
Literally,
need.
yeah.
And people like Hillary Clinton don't even give enough of a fuck to talk to us.
Yeah.
So we know he's a prick, but at least he's willing to play the game and try.
Yeah.
So you're not telling them things they don't know. You have to give them credit for being smarter than you think they are. You
That's
know,
fair.
we think of them as the stereotype, like honking redneck.
Yeah.
And they're brighter than that because they have to be, you know.
Yeah.
People aren't drooling idiots. Everyone's making it in this world according to the world that they live in. So we just need to reach them on that front, remind ourselves that they're just as clever as we are, usually. And I think that's a good start.
That's fair. I guess the last point I'd want to ask on this, as far as definitions for populism, this really isn't to do with definitions, but it is a follow-up to what you just said before we move on to looking at right versus left populism, is would it be fair to say that directly intervening on their material conditions of living increases the reach that we have for appealing to their common sense? So you're saying that, and I agree with you, as human beings, in general, people are clever enough that if you break down, say, climate change on a basic level and show them how greenhouse gas emissions work, they say, oh, well, shit, I get it. I had that exact moment when I was in college. I was a die-hard, absolute far-right conservative, and I joined the debate team. And they told me that I had to debate the affirmative on a debate about global warming. And I said, how could anyone do that? It's such obvious nonsense. And so they stifled their laughter, and they, on the board, drew it out for me how greenhouse gases work as far as trapping solar radiation. And I went, oh, shit. I really can't argue with that.
And that's all it takes.
So would you agree then that if we address the material conditions, and by that I mean access to good jobs, good health care, and good food and housing, that the common sense appeal of, say, progressive populism becomes more available to them, despite cultural differences?
Yeah, and that's why candidates like Bernie Sanders do so well. And especially in those areas, like, I don't know if you remember, Bernie Sanders won West Virginia.
I do not remember that. That's interesting.
He won it, against Hillary Clinton, so not that hard of a push, and he was very popular in a lot of the rural areas, Nebraska, Kansas. The Midwest was pretty solidly Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
The Rust Belt, too, was very, at least, amenable to him. And so you see that, and you saw that in the town halls that he did during the election and even after the election, when he's doing town halls with workers from huge corporations. When he did a town hall, I believe in West Virginia, with, coal mining families. He's coming in and showing them, and he's not doing it as a lecture. He's doing it as a discussion. He's not saying, hey, look, dummies, this is how I'm going to fix your life. You better vote for me. He's saying, tell me your concerns. I'll tell you my ideas for how we can address that. You tell me if you think that's a good option. It's a discussion between equals, and that's what we need to do. So you see, they can adequately express their concerns. They're given a platform to address those, and they're shown the left message for that. And when we organize around those sorts of ideals, we have a strong message. When you're running candidates like Hillary Clinton, and even Obama as he governed, not as he campaigned, what you're essentially selling people is everything's okay the way it is, status quo is good, let's keep doing more of this. And when people are suffering in those areas like West Virginia, they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? What is good about this?
Yeah.
And so they just feel completely erased from the map, basically. Like, nobody is seeing them, no one's addressing their needs. So when we organize and get ourselves behind a message that says, hey, majority of the country, we see you, we care about you, here's what we can present, because the Republicans are very good about that. And we know they don't actually give a fuck, but they're very good, and they don't have that sort of uppity hatred of their base that the Democrats are so known for.
Yeah.
Where they feel above them, and that's why I say we need to make sure we're reaching people on the level of equals, because the Republicans will get in there. They'll get in those, town halls in a post office in fucking Maine.
Yeah.
Like, they're in there with their sleeves rolled up, and they're saying, we need to protect our farmers, and here's what we're going to do for you. And they don't mean any of it.
No.
But they make a convincing enough pitch. And that's all people want, is they want to hear how you're going to better their lives. Then we have to come in, Mr. Obama, I hope you're listening. Then we have to come in.
He's one of our first subscribers here at Philosophy.
And if people buy our pitch, if they elect us, we need to make sure we back it up, because it's this 8 years of Obama not doing what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail that leads us into people getting fed up with the left and saying, fuck it, we're going to go with anyone who does a better job of selling this on the right. And that's when you get the far-right populism that Trump has swept in.
One thing that I think people like me, which is to say people who have progressive politics and pride themselves on a certain amount of aloof intellectual interest in things, it's very hard, I think, for us to keep in mind that the fuck it, we're going to throw a brick through the window mentality of people who said, well, no one's helping me, so I'm going to vote for Trump. Like, that's a real phenomenon. And I have a hard time grasping that sometimes, because it's hard for me to disentangle my own thoughts on progressive policies for me to say, fuck it, I'm going to throw a brick through the window, because I see that we have made some gains. I don't want to risk that. But you're right when you say that the majority of the country is suffering. We've got the epidemic of deaths of despair from opioid addictions. And Suicide, yeah.
But just on that point, and not to be... I was just talking about reaching people as equals, so it pains me to compare them to children. But that mentality of throw the brick through the window is very childlike, and not, I don't mean to judge the behavior or the mindset, but anyone who's ever worked with kids or studied child psychology or had that hands-on experience knows that kids are very needy and want attention and love, and, deservedly so. But if a child goes long enough without that recognition, without any attention from parents, whoever, they start acting out. They're throwing the brick through the window. Yeah. They're thinking, if I can't get any positive attention, I'll take whatever attention I can get, even if it's negative. And that's what voters will do too. If you ignore them, if you completely deny their needs or their attempts to interact with you on an equal level, they will come after you. They'll say, fuck it, I'm going to show you, and you're going to listen to me, and you're not going to like how that displays itself.
I think you'd agree with me, and this goes to the point of childish behavior, but I think reminds us why we shouldn't look down on people for that. I think you'd agree with me when I say that we're all a few missed meals away from that kind of behavior. Take your most progressive metropolitan center and shut the lights off for 3 days during the summer. And you'll see people making barricades and arming up pretty fast. Despair, I think, to psychologize a little bit, real despair, not like, oh shit, this is bad, but my material conditions of living are still perfectly fine, so I can go about ignoring how bad it might be. But like real physical despair of, there is no hope for me here, and I have no way of getting out of here, where here could be a small West Virginia town, and the nearest metropolitan center where you might find a job could be 100 miles away. that kind of despair will very quickly bring out all the ugly things that we are trained to tap down and suppress. So I think that because it's hard for me to not be patronizing too, but when I realize how bitchy I get if I skip lunch and I multiply that by a few more days of either missed meal or subpar living conditions or what have you, I can see it.
Well, and just, the social contract only works so long as both parties are upholding their end. So if the government fails their part of it, the people will too. But also, just as a side point for later, I would like at some point to discuss the patriarchal aspects of this elitism that the anti-populist crowd...
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that they would be... I'm curious to hear what you have to say. So we can insert that maybe even in this next question, since we're getting into a difference between, and I'm going to guess where the patriarchal aspect would fall. I'm going to ask, what's the difference between far right and far left versions of populism, in your opinion?
Well, and to me, when I think about populism, it's essentially a tool. And I think about it like the scientific method, or science, as we call it. It's a way of approaching an issue. So populism isn't a set group of principles or anything like that. It's merely the tool you use to reach people. So you have left and right populism, but that's just an instantiation of how those groups choose to use that tool. So much is in the same way that you can have good and bad science. People using science for good ends, they're doing it accurately, they're staying true to the scientific principles and methods. And then you can have, climate change denying scientists who are, corporate stooges and just using it poorly for their own ends.
A well-articulated shield.
Exactly. You can have the same with populism. And we know when that happens with science, it's not the fault of science. It's people using science poorly or, greedily. And it's the same with populism. It's not that populism is bad when you have someone like Steve Bannon, who is absolutely not a real populist, but he's happy to wear that cape.
Yeah.
And you have him misusing, the banner of populism. And then you have people like Bernie Sanders. So, to me, it's not... As a leftist, I like to think that left populism is just people doing populism well.
The real populism.
Yes, exactly. But it's true that it's possible to address people's needs from the conservative perspective and meet those needs and still have poor ends, as you mentioned before. Like, I don't remember what your example was, but something like closing the borders and chasing out all the immigrants. If done with keeping the populist ideals in mind, it can meet those ideals. It can solve, it can raise the unemployment, or not raise, it can lower the unemployment rate, it can have an increase on wages, those sorts of things, and still be something we would view as negative because of its repercussions on the immigrant community, that sort of thing. So it is possible to sufficiently do right populism so that it addresses people's material needs. But obviously, as leftists, we would say that that's not adequate. And we would present our own perspectives because to us it is possible to meet the material needs of the average person and not have the fallout of, being a white nationalist country. So to me, the only difference is, I guess, how big your group is that you're concerning yourself with. Because the right is very focused on their poor white male group. As much as I don't think they actually care about their needs, they know what their voting base is.
Yeah.
So when they make their appeals, they're making their appeals to the white males. And that's why you see it play out as you do in Donald Trump with the racist rhetoric, those sorts of talking points. And the left would just expand those circles to include brown people. Surprise, surprise. Women actually should have rights, according to us. Weird, I know. And so I think it's a matter of how big of a focus you take, and also I think that stems from how pure your ideals are. You know, when the right wing uses populism, we assume it's because they merely want to profit from it.
Yeah.
You know, they see it as a tool that will bolster their own power. You know, with someone like Bolsonaro, he rode it pretty comfortably to a win, and he's built his career on that. So it's been very good for him. And the left, hopefully, is using it because they genuinely want to help people, not merely as a means to an end.
Yeah. When I think about the difference between right and left-wing populism, I'm going to take a slightly different track from my personal perspective on this. You mentioned a lot the right hijacking populism, and I think that they do. People like Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Mitch McConnell doesn't give two creepy lizard shits about what happens to people in his home state. What is he, Kentucky?
Yes.
Yeah. He doesn't care what happens to people in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which I've been to. It's very pretty.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Used to preach there for a week. But so yeah, Mitch McConnell, you know, when he's sunning on a rock to like get up enough energy to go back to the Senate and further gut social benefit programs.
So brave of him.
Yeah, it's really, really brave. It takes a lot of sun to warm his blood up enough for him to slither back into that cold Senate chamber, though.
And hopefully soon it just won't be enough.
It might not be, no.
He won't wake from that eternal slumber.
I'm convinced that the only reason Mitch McConnell would ever support solar energy and green energy is to harvest more sunlight to keep his
shriveled corpse alive.
Shriveled
for one more
reptile
day.
blood flowing through his brain, through his body. So Mitch McConnell, who I also hope is listening because he was our second subscriber after Brock Obama.
Damn, we have a big reach.
We really do. Narrow but big people. So you talk about how the right hijacks populism, and you're not wrong. But there are people who are right-wing populists who are lower down the hierarchy, who are sincere populists. So whereas Steve Bannon might be some calculating shit who just takes advantage. Yeah, millionaire who takes advantage of it. Yeah. You will have someone who is destitute, is on the losing end of every scheme that the right hatches, but they sincerely are a right-wing populist. And I think that...
Are you thinking of a voter more, or somebody who's like a lower politician?
A voter.
Okay.
A voter. And so when I think of the difference between right and left-wing populism, I think about like the structures that those two groups on their base are willing to uphold. So like a right-wing populist to me would be someone who their version of populism kind of idolizes, like in an almost mythic religious sense, the abstract idea of the common man. Mm-hmm. So like whatever the common man does, and I do mean man, getting into that patriarchal aspect.
And that's where you saw the Joe the Plumber
exactly
during the campaign.
Exactly. So there are people like Joe the Plumber who, you know, they are committed to this idolization of the abstracted notion of the common man. I think another really common one you see is the nuclear family. Mm-hmm. Like, it's put on this pedestal where obviously bullshit shows like Leave It to Beaver are held up almost like religious iconography depicting what it ought to be like. So, you'll have the Mother Mary holding the Christ child as the image of good godly love, and then you'll also have like the episode where Beaver apologizes for breaking the vase as like this beautiful image of, I don't know if that episode of it exists. I've never seen the show.
I'm sure it does.
But like, so there is this kind of pseudo-religious idolization of these social structures. And on the left, I would say that, and this is kind of a criticism I think that could be leveled at the left, there is sometimes like a fetishization. Well, I never say that right. They make destroying certain structures a fetish to the point where it can get in the way of a productive politic.
Would you consider as an example something like focusing on taking down every Christopher Columbus statue in the world as opposed to focusing on more material needs?
That, or like the person who's at the rally where Bernie Sanders explains how democratic socialism can help lift everyone up, and the people in the room kind of come around to the idea that we could truly be a united society and help our weakest members. And then someone in the very back stands up and says, also dissolve the institution of marriage. And boom, we lose the crowd. And I think that sometimes...
Abolish ICE.
Yeah, abolish ICE. Well, I could get behind that.
Oh, no, I'm definitely behind it.
Yeah, I agree. It really bugs me when my chair hits that.
Well, you've brought up a lot of stuff here.
I have, and I'm wrapping... that's the difference I would draw, is that right-wing populism and left-wing populism have different structures that they uphold. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some things that the left upholds as a pseudo-sacred structure that I agree with, like universal health care, housing for everyone, basic human dignity and respect regardless of your whatever characteristics you might have. Even lizard people, Mitch McConnell, if you're listening, even your scaly kind, when they wake up and crawl down from their nest, are welcome at the table.
We would give you health care for your scaly, slimy skin.
Exactly. We would provide you and your kind with all the shallow, muddy ponds you need to raise your own families in clutches by the millions. But that's where I draw the difference.
Okay. First, to address your first point, when you were talking about how there could be sincere right-wing populists at the lower levels, to me, yes, to the extent that I think voters can certainly have what they see as justified right-wing principles. But to me, it's not populist in the sense that I see populism as something coming from above. Like, populism is what the powerful use to reach the less powerful. Okay. So to me, and this might just be a matter of semantics, but I think there's at least some thought behind it that should be pointed out. The voters aren't populist. It's the people appealing to the voters that are the populists. Because the voters are the people being reached. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who are your intended target. So to me, they aren't the populists because they aren't the ones given the megaphone. Okay. Like, populism is a tool of the politicians to reach the people.
Okay, I think I see.
Yeah, I wouldn't call the voters populist, even though they might share the same, in theory, principles as the politicians reaching them, and they're agreeing on a plan of action or a set of ideals. But I just wouldn't call the voters populists, but that's me.
So it might be like correct me if I'm wrong, but you might think of populism itself as like a superstructure idea that you could plug in almost any ideology, from the far right person I described to the far left person I described. It depends on how the powerful use it.
Yeah. Okay. And assuming that the powerful are actually intending to reach the majority lower classes. And I think that's been one of the problems of the more centrist left that we've been deriding recently, is their focus hasn't been average Joes.
No.
Gross. They think of themselves as this elite group, the intellectuals, the educated, and so they still do it now when they say they want to try to appeal to conservative voters, however misguided that strategy is. They're looking for middle-class, educated suburban whites.
Yeah.
That's not your target area.
No.
The Republicans' most vulnerable group to pick off are those lower classes whose needs aren't being adequately addressed.
Yeah. And their largest base to pick off.
Yeah. And then to go to your second point, which was... the fetishization
Yes.
of the nuclear family, yada yada. I'm actually reading an interesting book about that. Jamie on the Majority Report mentioned it, and it sounded good, so I bought it. Caliban and the Witch. It's Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation.
Interesting.
And it's all about basically how it starts with serfdom and then the ensuing witch trials and all of that, and how basically the nobility, who became the capitalists, all that, used ideas like the nuclear family, heteronormativity, those sorts of things, as a means to oppress the lower classes and enforce this rigid notion of what is moral, what is right, what is good, what we should be fetishizing, and using that as a way to keep the labor force controlled. And basically...
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very good. That has always played into the conservative mindset in our politics, insofar as the conservatives are the ones we think of as, like, big business, corporations, those concerned with making sure capitalism stays in power, basically. Yeah. So I think that is a good explanation of where that fetish comes from.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a manner of capitalists exerting their force over the proletariat.
Using that as a springboard, I know you said you wanted to talk about far-right populism and patriarchy.
Oh, it's not the far right.
Just populism. Oh no, I'm sorry. About the idea of reaching
elites.
out and reaching the common person as patriarchy.
And that was my most, where my most, I guess my biggest interest in the topic was that the whole structure of exploitation and its ties to patriarchy and that sort of thing. So I was coming at it from a very Marxist perspective. So obviously to me, to take the anti-populist stance is to say the needs of the average person either aren't well-founded, which I think is more where you came from as an anti-populist, saying they don't know their own needs well enough, they aren't adequately educated on their own needs, or they don't understand, or we just don't give a fuck about their needs. And that's the exploitation side of it. You know, those are the capitalists, those are big business coming in and saying, you know, screw the little guy, we're putting a landfill in this neighborhood, or we're dumping in this river, whatever. So there's the exploitation side, and then the side that you came from, I would call patriarchal, in the sense that, you know, I had to take feminist ethics in college, and I hated it at the time as a conservative, but looking back, it was one of my most formative classes. And it was actually, the professor mentioned she wanted to call it lesbian ethics, but I guess wanted to avoid the politics of that image. And it was essentially describing the difference between what we would call a heterosexual relationship and a homosexual relationship, and not necessarily based on the actual genders of the people involved, but using those as kind of the ideal. in a heterosexual relationship, we're taught, we're socially inculcated with the notion of the man as the patriarch. He's the dominant one. He's the one with authority. He's kind of the leader of the pair.
Boy, not to drive home a criticism of the patriarchy, but could I interrupt you first?
So,
only because you saying that sparked a memory. On Facebook, I saw a young man recently. His name is Caleb. He posted he and I met in preacher training back when I was a conservative Christian. He recently made a post on Facebook asking whether or not women should hold positions of political or economic power, since the Bible always presents them as subservient to men. So I say that just to back up what you're saying, which is this idea still does exist out there of the chain of being, and like man is one rung above woman and maybe a rung beneath angels. And so thankfully there weren't a lot of replies. It was very insular. Only other women from the Church of Christ commented saying, absolutely they shouldn't. You're a brave young man for speaking the truth. And it was disgusting. It was absolutely fucking disgusting. If for whatever reason you listen to this, Caleb, fuck you. So yeah, you sparked a memory that I had to.
Well, and you see that in the conservative side, they're very deeply rooted in their ideas of patriarchy, even though they would, recoil at that phrasing. But they're very much, which is not to say it doesn't exist on the left, because it absolutely does, but it's much more ingrained in the conservative mindset of men need to be dominant, they need to be the primary breadwinners in the house. If a woman is working, it should be a shame for a man. Or if a guy is a stay-at-home dad, conservatives hate that guy and what he means for their masculinity. So you see it a lot on the right, mostly. Still exists on the left. And then, so you have the standard heteronormative relationship that embodies the patriarchy. And then looking at a lesbian relationship in its ideal, recognizing that there are plenty of abusive, dominant, submissive lesbian relationships as well. But the ideal is that, the two women would be equals, both recognizing each other's agency, allowing for self-realization and self-direction. And so that's the kind of the compare and contrast between heterosexuality and homosexuality in their ideals. And that comes into play with populism, because when we, even though I didn't hold this stance, you did, we hold ourselves to be this intellectual vanguard that has to show the people what their needs are. And I said we do need to do that, but in a way that's a discussion, listening to them and trusting that they know their needs and can, reiterate them to us, explain them. But this notion that they don't know what they need or want, and they don't know how to solve their own problems, and we'll be the ones to teach them, that is the epitome of patriarchy, in the sense that we are the authorities, and we're here to tell you exactly what it is you need, even though I've been to West Virginia. I've certainly never spent any amount of time there. Like, who am I to go in and tell a guy who's been living there for 50 years that I know better than him what his needs are? So we need to get over that sense that I think is rigidly ingrained in all of us, that we get this notion that we are so intellectual, we're so well informed, we know what people need. And that's why I say it's not far right populism that entails a good amount of patriarchy. It's all of us, because that's what American culture has been built upon. And so we need to fight against that kind of cultural background that we all have that tells us we need to assert authority. We need to tell people what they need rather than listen. And so we need to get back to that lesbian ethics of we're equals. I'm not here to solve your problems for you. I'm here as support, and I will help you in any way that I can. Let's arrive at a solution together.
Yeah. Do you think that there are situations where, to use your terminology, the patriarchal model is appropriate? And so I'm thinking of like, this has nothing to do with populism. I'm just curious to get your opinion on this. So like, you've got a lecture hall of med students, and you've got the med professor, who presumably was a doctor or still is a doctor. And there is no back and forth discussion in this scenario. It is, I know more than you about this I guess maybe the better question is, in well-defined contexts of limited domain and scope, do you think the teacher-student model is appropriate in those contexts? Or do you think that it is such a thoroughly flawed model that there is no context where, beyond like maybe passing moments where like if I don't know how to change a tire and you do, which is a real thing that happened.
You're not allowed to teach.
Yeah.
I will teach you how to change a tire again, don't worry.
Yeah, I stood there on the side of the road.
I hope you took notes.
I did. No, I was too busy freaking out because remember I got that tiny cut on my finger?
I don't remember that.
You don't remember that?
I just remember doing all the work.
You did do all the work, but I was trying at one point and failing. And I got a tiny cut on my finger, and when we came back to get Tara's car, I had to Google... Tetanus, because I was terrified of getting...
You would.
And so, do you think that it is so fundamentally flawed that it never has any application?
I think you're allowed to teach people things, although as much as I label myself at all, I do think I'm an anarchist, so I do have a natural gag reflex at hierarchies. But no, I think it's more in the mindset and the strategies you use in teaching people, because, and I think we can all think of examples there. When you have professors, there are definitely professors who are very authoritarian. They say, you shut up, you listen, take notes, this is going to be on the test, I'm going to talk for 75 minutes and very little input from the students. But no, there's also plenty of good examples of professors who think of it more as a discourse, even if, in a med school setting, it's harder to incorporate student knowledge, but, there are ways of teaching where it becomes that discussion where it's, and it's harder to do in a lecture, obviously, but you can have the mindset of, I'm not better than these people. I'm not their boss. I just happen to know more. And it's okay to know more. And it's okay to want to share that with people. But you need to bear in mind that you're equals. They have things that they know that you don't, that they could teach you if you were so inclined to listen. And you're just imparting some of your knowledge. They have knowledge too. This isn't about, I'm better, you're dumb, look at me go. It's, how do I reach people and make sure that we're on the same level by the end of this conversation.
Okay. Do you have any more you'd like to say before?
No, that's okay.
All right, thank you.
Just to bring in the radical feminist aspect of this all.
Thank you. So there is a problem that factors in, and we might not be able to get to everything today.
It's
so
okay.
If
I
at
can talk
point,
as long as you want me to.
Good deal. There are so many things, by the way, that you've said that I want to go on a side tangent on. That's going to happen.
Oh, I know.
We need
I'm
to
sure
do some. We need to do
painful
other
for you.
recordings because there are some things I'd like to
I'm surprised you don't have a notebook.
press you on. Well, I'm going to be. I have to listen to this whole thing again to edit it. So I'm going to frame. It's really fitting that this is right after you get done talking about egalitarianism, because I'm going to frame this in a really, really, really bitter, mean-spirited way. The lowest common denominator problem. So if we are trying to reason with a population, and we're not going to go the hyper elitist route, let's say we're not going to go the elitist route at all. We're trying to go the anarchist route. Mm-hmm. But we still, functionally, a group of people have to reason with another group of people. Mm-hmm. And if we're trying to persuade them, it's always going to be a smaller group. Not always, but trying to reason with a larger group. Mm-hmm. So you've got a little group of committed anarchists who are trying to non-authoritatively reason with a crowd away from elitism. Some members of that crowd, any crowd that's large enough to be a crowd, you're just statistically going to wind up with some people in there who have ridiculous opinions. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that as a moral judgment. I'm saying that you're going to have people who, for example, are anti-vaxxers. They are wrong. Mm-hmm. The material things that they believe about the way the world works are factually and functionally incorrect, which is a nice way to say they believe something that's fucking ridiculous. So if you're trying to reason with a crowd of people, and let's say you're trying to discuss educational policies or anything, you're going to encounter people that are anti-vaxxers, or people like anti-vaxxers, who have these opinions about things that simply are not true. Now, some people can have an untrue opinion, and that's fine. I can reason with you about how we should have universal health care, even if you believe in astrology. Like, we can still reason about that. Mm-hmm. But if you are an anti-vaxxer, or if I'm trying to win over a population, and 10% of that population are anti-vaxxers, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to run our local co-op healthcare system, or a national healthcare system, what do we do about the people who just intransigently will not concede ground on beliefs that we know are wrong? And the reason I say lowest common denominator is that I kind of frame, I kind of frame that as a joke just to be an elitist dick. But the real question, the way it should be framed, is the more boring, dry way to put it would be something like the epistemic outlier problem. Like, how do you deal with people who have beliefs or systems of belief that you just can't work with, but you still want to reach those people?
Well, and just less importantly, as a strategic point, I would just point out that I would never address a large crowd of similarly minded anti-vaxxers. Mm-hmm. You know, I wouldn't. That's not a good way to convince people in groups. If you've read Gustave Le Bon, you know you're never gonna sway.
Oh,
mobs.
I'm the dick, and you're. If you've read Gustave Le Bon, then you'll. Yeah.
But yeah, so just strategically focus on smaller groups, individuals, or if they are in groups, try to get sort of mixed opinions, that sort of thing. You don't want to be, you know, facing 1,000 anti-vaxxers who are all united against you, because you're just never going to achieve anything in that setting.
Ironically, they have herd immunity.
No, but I think a good starting point that I always go back to, you know, remember, they're not stupider than you, they just are working from different premises, that sort of thing, that I try to keep in that, you know, average Joe mindset.
Gross.
We just have to say that every time. No, so anti-vaxxers, those sorts of people, it helps to start by reminding yourself they aren't coming from bad motivations. Mm-hmm. And their inclinations, at least in how you interpret the world, are good. And those are the sorts of inclinations we want people to have. You know, they want to understand, they're trying to protect themselves, and they're looking for information on what is correct. They're just encountering false information, and like all of us, they have those tendencies to, you know, confirmation bias or herd mentality, those sorts of things that we all fall prey to. So it's a matter of overcoming that in the sense of providing better information, and this is why you need to do it on a one-on-one or very small group in that sort of setting, because they'll be more open to information, because they're just better focused, they're listening more actively. And this is why we see studies that say, people are most likely to change a belief if it comes from friends and family. They see their aunt share something on Facebook, they give it more credit than if CNN shares something on Facebook. That sort of thing. You want to reach people on that personalized level. And so we need to appeal to those good tendencies that people have, to look for information, to solve problems, self-protection. We want to appeal to those in the ways that we know will lead to a better conclusion, insofar as we know anything. So if we think someone is wrong, it's going to be completely counterproductive to come in and say, you're an idiot. Why would you believe that? Like, in their mind, they've reached a conclusion from premises that follow. Those premises might, be inaccurate or based on faulty information, but we need to work on their information, not on their mode of reaching their conclusion. And so I think as the people who have a bad tendency toward elitism, we need to get over the left always tends, and this is why they get such a reputation for being pro-big government, that sort of thing. We have a tendency when we say, well, we just know better than you, we do become a bit authoritarian in that regard. So, and that's why it brings up the labeling movement for me. People who want labels about what food is GMO modified or anything like that. Because, I say I'm kind of an anarchist, and I'm always hesitant to prop up a powerful structure. To me, if I'm on the side of power, it's a decent sign that I'm in the wrong place. It, obviously not always true, but that raises a red flag for me. And so our solution, in terms of the labeling controversy, but also applicable to all of these, our solution should never be less information, more authority. So in the labeling aspect, the solution can't be fuck people, they don't know science, we're just going to let corporations withhold information from people and they just need to get over it. Like, we know GMOs won't hurt you, so fuck it, you have to eat your GMO corn, and we're not gonna, it's a very authoritarian mindset to say corporations don't have to give the consumer the information that they want.
Yeah.
You see that it sets a very bad precedent.
It does.
And so, to me, the solution is always more information, better information. So we think it's silly to appeal to the consumer's faulty belief that GMOs might hurt them, but think about how that plays out in real life. So if you deny those people the information that they want, saying this corn has been genetically modified, you deny them that information. They get cancer in 10 years. They say, their own confirmation bias, I bet it was all that fucking corn the government's been feeding me. I have no idea if it's got GMOs or not in it. I bet it's that GMO corn. And it completely, it makes their belief concrete in their mind. They were right all along, because that's what we're always looking for. And now they've got cancer, and now they've reinforced the notion that GMOs cause cancer. If you give them the information and you say, okay, here's your non-GMO corn, here's your GMO corn, they can spend the next 10 years eating their non-GMO corn and get cancer later on. And suddenly they have evidence that it's not GMOs that cause cancer. And conversely, they can see their cousin who's been eating GMO corn this whole time and doesn't have cancer, and they go, I guess I might have been wrong. Granted, people might not be so easily swayed, but you've given them the information to make a better choice.
Something to think about.
Yeah, and so you're only working to reinforce their notion of this big, secretive, deep state, authoritarian, like, when you withhold information from people, or when you play this, I know better than you just need to listen to what I say, you're not doing yourself any favors. And I think that's the sense that people got from Hillary Clinton, specifically, why she was such a repulsive candidate for a lot of people, is because she embodied that sort of, this isn't a discussion, I'm super qualified, fuck you, you need to listen to me, and just go with it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm with her, just be with me.
Yeah.
And you need to take that more, and that's why Bernie Sanders was so popular with people, and he's just so damn likable. Like, you can't listen to him and not feel warm and bubbly, because he feels like he could be your buddy or your grandpa, or he's someone who would be fun to chat to. So
Hillary would be your cold aunt who shows up to the funeral and insists that she's the best one qualified to help you plan what to do with the estate.
And she hasn't cried a tear in 50 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's how
her eyes blink weirdly sideways.
All right, Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
But no, that to me, that's how you deal with this lowest common denominator gross term you've come up with. Is you reach people on a personal level, give them more information, fight your elitist urge to just be like, fuck you, do what I say.
Well, one thing to kind of piggyback on what you said that I think the left is also culpable for is we tend to moralize knowledge. And there is that sociological term, the curse of knowledge, where it's just when you know of something, it's hard for you to fathom other people not knowing it. It feels actually like you're the last person to arrive at the party. Like, oh shit, I'm just now learning about quantum mechanics? Jesus Christ, I'm so behind the times. And so I feel like whenever people on the left come into some knowledge about a good idea or a progressive idea, and I don't know why this is, but we tend to really moralize that knowledge to the point where if someone else disagrees with us and it comes to light that they don't know, we get angry. I see people say, well, fuck you, read a book. Fuck you, go read up on it. And my thought is always, these days anyway, you have no idea how lucky you are when you happen into some information. Information is hard to find, especially now that there's so much bad information on the internet. And the bar for publishing is, thankfully for me, really low. It's like I have a chance, but like so does everyone else. And so, like, if we know something about how, if you know how universal basic income, to pick kind of a controversial example, could work just fine, but someone else doesn't have that knowledge, and your first reaction is, well, why don't you fucking Google it? Like, that's that moralization of knowledge, which I think if we're being reasonable, we should acknowledge that there's no reason to assume that some stranger that you're meeting, probably on the internet, has the same access to information that you do, because the algorithms that are shoving information in your face are going to be different than the algorithms shoving information in their face.
Yeah.
So we're all trapped in these weird algorithm bubbles, and it's easy to feel like what you're looking at is universal. And, you need to be really careful with how moralistic you are about knowledge, which I think plays to your point about how we need to overcome the elitist ideal of, listen, you dumb fucking hick.
Yeah.
I went to college and I have a master's degree in English literature, and I'm here to tell you what you should think about universal housing.
Yeah.
They might not have some of the same information you've been able to gain access to because of the algorithmic bubble we're in this nightmare social reality world, or social media world we live in. They just might not have seen all these same articles as you.
Yeah.
Or they might have seen it from a different slant, which makes it not the same sort of knowledge for them. So.
And I think that, I definitely think you're right in saying that it plagues the left in particular. And that's just one more area where Republicans are kicking our asses, is they will always, always, always be happy to say where they got their information. Like, they're not killing themselves to cite sources, but they will always be like, oh, you didn't know dandelions cure cancer? fun thing that I read from my conservative family on Facebook.
Interesting.
They will always be doing that, and they are never the ones to say, fuck you, read a book. First of all, because they don't believe in reading books. Sorry, I have to get my elitism in there. But no, and so I do see that reaction a lot, and I'm more forgiving of it. It comes up a lot in black activist circles, those sorts of things, when somebody is like, how can you say racism still exists today?
Oh, yeah.
And they say, are you fucking kidding me? Like, I'm not gonna educate your ass if you don't know it, that's on you. And I'm more forgiving in that aspect, just because of the amount of oppression they've been dealing with for so long. I get the angry reaction, so I can't really judge it there. Yeah. But just as a strategy point, if you're trying to win people over to your side, which is the entire point of populism, it's obviously not good strategy to react with 2 middle fingers to everyone and say, fuck you. So we do have to overcome that huge problem that we have of being like, well, you just don't know as much as I do. Haha, you're not as good as me. Yeah. And so, I don't know, it's just...
I saw someone one time, they were in a Facebook argument about, I think it was different gender identities. And someone was saying, well, that's not true. There's only 2 of them. And they said, why don't you fucking Google it? And I was like, that's the last thing you want to tell someone who doesn't know something. Because
especially given the effect that they are more likely to be open to that information if it comes from someone they know.
Because they're going to Google it. But number one, using search engines is difficult. Like, I take it for granted because when I was in college, I was on the debate team. And you had to learn how to use a search engine to find good sources. But if you tell a person in the context of like the transgenderism, I hate to even call it a debate, but the forced debate we keep having to have on that, if you tell someone, why don't you just fucking Google it, dipshit, they're going to go Google, why are there only 2 genders? And that's what they're going to find.
That, and you have no idea the quality of sources. They're open to the entire internet.
Yeah. And I get the justifiable righteous indignation. But and I'm forgiving of things like when like a Black Lives Matter activist would act with anger and incredulity at someone who seriously says, well, how can you say racism still exists? I think there are some things that are epistemically less forgiving. So like, if someone were to say, what do you mean the earth is round? Like, I'm a little bit less forgiving than if they were to say something like, how could universal basic income ever work? Mm-hmm. Because UBI is a complicated, nuanced policy position. Earth being round it's just general, it's given.
Well, and just, sorry if I'm interrupting a train of thought, but just to cut in on the roundness of the earth, and all of that ties back to my feelings towards your lowest common denominator. That's another way of reminding ourselves that these people are coming from good intentions and even good inclinations toward understanding the world. Mm-hmm. And that's as frustrating as flat earthers are, and as much as it makes me want to pull my hair out, and conspiracy theorists of any kind, 9/11 truthers, whatever. A small part of me is always grateful that they exist in society. I think it's a healthy tendency to say we need to understand how we know what we know. Mm-hmm. We need to be willing to question our sources of knowledge. So I'm always a little bit thankful that there's someone asking, well, how the fuck do you know that the earth is round? Because I don't know how we know that shit. I just accept it. I haven't thought about it. I know more about it now because flat earthers exist, and that's the only reason that I know that.
I met my first flat earther a couple weeks ago.
Did he call you a globe head?
No. She's someone I work with, and...
Silly me, I assumed it was a man. How is it a woman?
I was gonna... You could make like a weird scholastic argument, like women who are more predisposed to think in 3 dimensions because
All right, Sam Harris.
Yeah, God. No, so yeah, I had some little factoid written on a bulletin board because I was doing a fact of the week thing, and it was about rogue planets. And she said, "Do you believe in space?" And for a second, I was like, "She read Kant," and I was like, "Are we going to have a debate about the existence of spatial dimensions?" Or does she mean space? And I said, yeah. And she goes,
like outer space or the concept of living in 3D?
Yeah. And so she said, well, no, I mean, like, space with stars and stuff. You think that stars are real? And I said, yes, I do. And so that led to a conversation, and she revealed that she was a flat earther. And we had an interesting conversation. It was clear that she was curious about things, and she was receptive to what I said.
And that's what I mean, that they come from good inclinations and tendencies. Like, they generally are. You know, you have to be open-minded.
Yeah.
If you're the person who says, well, for 18 years I thought the Earth was round, and suddenly I'm presented with information that it's not, and I buy it, that's an open mind. Maybe too open. But if that exists.
In another time and place, they would have been the people who figured out how to make wheels. Like, they would have been the people who were always wondering, like, well, why? And in the right context, that can lead to great things.
And we might be giving them too much credit. Like, thousands and thousands and thousands of them probably killed themselves trying to think of some.
Yeah, I guess that's
stupid
true.
Shit
Alchemy
like
did kill itself out.
Let's be real. We can be a little elitist. They're not necessarily the brightest bunch, but they have good tendencies, and those are the tendencies we should appeal to.
You mentioned conspiracy theorists, and I was going to pass this over, but I can't help myself. Do you think there's a cutoff point where you say, fuck it, I'm just going to try to out-political power you? So, like, let's say...
You mean as opposed to reaching them?
Yes. So, like, people who believe that the MAGA bomber...
was Hillary Clinton?
Well, was Hillary Clinton or... let's check and see. People who believe that the MAGA bomber was a Democratic operative.
Mm-hmm.
And they cite the fact that all the stickers look new on his van.
Mm-hmm.
And other ridiculous stuff. Where do you draw a line and say, you know what? I hope eventually you stop thinking with these pathological, paranoid rules that seem to govern how you look at the world. But I'm just not going to worry about your opinion on policy positions with how we deal with, like, bombs being sent in the mail. Because you just don't fucking count right now.
Yeah, and that's, you know, everything that I've mentioned up until now is a strategy or a way of reaching people is only in an ideal world. You know, like you say, there's a limit. Not everyone is reachable. Not everyone is rational or open to a discussion. So I guess you take what you can get. You do your best, and that's why I'm giving what I think are good strategies, because so long as you're using your best efforts, your best information, your most personable charm, you do what you can, and at the end of the day, you know, there's going to be 30% of America that just says, fuck you, get off my lawn, like, and you see that in plenty of studies, you know, 30% of people will support Trump no matter what he does, 30% of people...
is it 30%, or is it 30%?
Okay. Using some number.
Okay.
Whatever the number is, there is a decent number of people who just are resistant to anything that we believe is true or right or moral, whatever. So there's some group that's definitely larger than zero that are unwinnable. And that's what politics is. You win over who you can, and you know, to be a bit patriarchal, you dominate the ones you can't. Like, and that's, you know, take it or leave it. That's what democracy is majority rule.
Yeah.
So you can't win over everyone, but you want to create a world where, despite their protests, the minority is supported, is taken care of in such a way that, maybe they do become open to what you have to say. If Bernie Sanders ran for president again and won, maybe he'd win with 50% of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
You want, and his goal should be to create a world, create a country that the people who didn't vote for him realize that, they were wrong. And you see that, him specifically, you see that in his Senate career. He is senator of Vermont and has something like an 83% approval rating in Vermont. And not 83% of Vermonters are leftists at all. And there's a huge population of people who say, I don't agree with him on everything, but I know he gives a fuck.
Yeah.
I know he cares about me. I know his heart is in the right place. So even if I don't agree with him, I approve of him, And that's the sort of world you want to create.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us here at Philosophy with my and Molly's first part of our conversation about populism. We're going to go ahead and end things here. This is about halfway through the content that we had set out to discuss. So we were right on the cusp of discussing things like strategies and tactics and how the left should pursue a populist policy. So you'll simply have to join us again next time when we reconvene to finish our conversation about populism and discuss whether or not it is for better or for worse. Once more, thank you for joining us here at Philosophy, where our goal is for it to be as fun as philosophy and coffee at the same time, every time.